Man devoted his entire life to deciphering its cryptic messages. Next, on Ancient Mysteries. The British Museum in London is filled with many remarkable antiquities from ancient Egypt. Among their treasures are 3,000-year-old mummies and colossal statues honoring great pharaohs. But there is one item that is more valuable than all the rest. At the entrance to their Egyptian collection is a large stone tablet, one that could be overlooked if not for its conspicuous and prominent position. It's known as the Rosetta Stone, one of the most important treasures of all time. What is the Rosetta Stone, and how did this seemingly insignificant rock forever change our belief in mankind's past? For 2,000 years, the history of ancient Egypt was buried in the sands of time. Travelers and scholars were aware of the existence of these mysterious people, but nothing was known about them. What kind of men built these gigantic pyramids the size of mountains? To what gods did they dedicate their enormous temples the size of cities? And why did they preserve their dead, burying with them treasures beyond belief? Visitors to this ancient world find strange picture writing everywhere. First called hieroglyphs by the Greeks, this mystical language fills the temples, monuments, and tombs. Walls abound with bizarre pictures of animals, human heads, and unknown shapes. Many surround paintings of Egyptians giving offerings to animal-headed gods. Even their dead were buried with this sacred script on their wrappings and coffins. What do these strange carvings say? Did the Egyptians possess black magic medicine and powerful weapons? Would they provide us with answers to the Bible's mysteries? What was needed was a clue, a key to unlock the mystery. Like the rediscovery of ancient Egypt, the finding of an unusual and puzzling tablet would be only the beginning. By the time of Christ, the ancient Egyptians were already legends of a distant past. Greek and Roman historians could only guess at what knowledge this once powerful civilization possessed. As the centuries passed and Europe had its Renaissance, ancient Egypt remained silent, waiting for its own rebirth. It took one of the most powerful men of all time to awaken Egypt from its sleep, a man whose leadership in battle was matched only by his passion for history. During the late 1700s, the French and British were fighting a war for world domination. In 1798, General Napoleon Bonaparte proposed leading the French army on a military invasion of Egypt. If the French could command this crossroads between Europe and Asia, they would control trade and become the most powerful country in the world. By this time, the 29-year-old Napoleon had become a legend in the French army. His victories over Austrian forces in Italy established France and himself as new powers to be reckoned with. Napoleon's sense of history and destiny led him to view Egypt as his next prize. On July 1st, 1798, Napoleon's army sailed into Egypt's port city of Alexandria. In addition to 38,000 soldiers, 167 of France's top scientists and scholars were on board. Rarely have military expeditions had academic interests as well. What was Napoleon's plan? Why was he fascinated with ancient Egypt? Like Alexander the Great, did Napoleon believe his destiny was to annex Egypt on his way towards conquering the world? The egocentric Napoleon viewed Egypt as more than just a cornerstone in his empire. He knew of its legends, its power, and its history. This was the land of the pharaohs, These kings were considered gods by their subjects. They ruled over the world's greatest civilization for 2,000 years. Napoleon was determined to learn their secrets. Like Julius Caesar, Napoleon believed he could win the hearts and minds of the Egyptians. Did he believe he was to be their next pharaoh? As a member of the French Institute of Egyptology, Napoleon personally selected the academics who formed his expeditionary force. While the French army swept up the Nile, crushing all opposition, the scholars immediately began their work setting up an institute in Cairo. This became the headquarters for Napoleon's academic expedition. They scattered across Egypt, exploring tombs, climbing monuments, studying, sketching, and painting everything in sight. The wealth of information was unbelievable. Napoleon demanded to be constantly informed. If any answers to their mysteries were uncovered, he wanted to know immediately. While Napoleon's men were busy annexing both Egypt's land and antiquities, England would not stand idly by. Within weeks, the British Navy attacked the French, destroying their ships and laying a 2-year-long siege on Napoleon's men. Napoleon himself eventually snuck past the blockade and back to France. His hopes for ruling the world were dashed. As the abandoned French army fought to stay alive, the scientists and scholars were giving birth to modern Egyptology. Racing against their inevitable removal by the British, they stepped up their efforts to copy and analyze as much as possible. The answers to these dormant mysteries had to be found. Ironically, it was neither a scientist nor a scholar, but a soldier who made the most important discovery of all. In mid-July 1799, as the long siege wore on, the French continued bolstering their defenses. Situated along the Nile as it enters the Mediterranean Sea is a town called Rosetta. In order to rebuild the town's old Arabic fort, men under the command of Lieutenant Pierre Bouchard started to reconstruct the walls. Arabs commonly took material from ancient temples and used them in their own buildings. Unnoticed in these walls, buried since the time of the pharaohs, was a large stone tablet. While the soldiers tore down the fort's walls, the tablet was stumbled upon. Immediately, the soldiers noticed something strange and potentially valuable. Carved on this dusty stone were 3 types of writing: Greek, a common Egyptian script called demonic, and hieroglyphs.
The stone was a kind of magical discovery, and I think it is a piece of extraordinary luck that whoever was there had the perspicacity and the interest to say, gosh, you know, what have we got here? Could be important, key to the hieroglyphs. One can imagine that a less well-informed officer might have said, oh, no, it's just an old stone, build it into the fort. People have often said, you know, thank God it was a French officer, not a British officer, because, you know, they were perhaps a little more intellectually minded.
Dubbed the Rosetta Stone, it measured 3 feet 9 inches high and 2 feet 4 inches wide. It weighed nearly 1,500 pounds. French General Jacques Menu ordered it sent to the Institute in Cairo to have the Greek translated. What did it say? Could the Greek be used to translate hieroglyphs? The discovery caused an immediate sensation. The Greek language was understood, so scholars quickly translated the text. It was a decree honoring a Greek pharaoh, Ptolemy V, on his 1-year anniversary. In exchange for services rendered by him benefiting Egypt, plaques were to be placed in temples throughout the land. It was known the Greeks had ruled Egypt from 300 BC until the decades before Christ. How did this tablet survive for over 1,800 years? Did others exist? The actual wording seemed unimportant until the last line was read. This decree shall be inscribed on a stela of hard stone in sacred and native and Greek characters. All three scripts said the same thing. The news spread quickly back to Europe.
This stone offers great interest for the study of hieroglyphic characters. Perhaps it will even give us the key at last. Courrier de l'Égypte, August 1799.
The Rosetta Stone would not stay in French hands long. The British siege was soon to tighten, forcing the French to surrender. How did a French general try to hide the stone and prevent the British from taking possession? During negotiations, English military officers demanded the stone. Did they believe that translated hieroglyphs would reveal military secrets? Would this stone be the voice to end ancient Egypt's long silence? Napoleon's two-year military campaign in Egypt was a complete disaster. Over 9,000 men were killed, and the French Navy was decimated by the British. Those who remained were now trapped in Egypt, isolated by a British naval siege along the Mediterranean coast. However, both scientifically and culturally, the Egyptian expedition was of great and long-lasting importance. This was the birth of modern archaeology, man's search for his own past. And with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, it seemed as if the great secrets of Egypt would be finally revealed. The door was now poised to be opened onto this long, silent land of magic and mystery. The looming deciphering of the hieroglyphs was keenly watched by both the French and English military. French officers in Egypt knew firsthand the power and glory of the ancient Egyptians. The indisputable evidence was before their eyes. The pyramids and temples were obviously built by a great and advanced civilization. If the Rosetta Stone could be used to translate their language, might Egypt's former glory be resurrected and become that of France? How quickly could the French decipher the stone and thus read the hieroglyphs? Would the code be cracked before the British forced their surrender? Under military orders, scholars at the Institute raced to complete the deciphering. The Rosetta Stone had 3 texts written on it, each in a different script. Reading top to bottom, they were hieroglyphs, demonic, and Greek. The Greek section told of the tablet having the same information written in all 3. While Greek was easily understood, several obstacles stood in the way of using it to translate the 2 Egyptian scripts. First and foremost, nobody had been able to speak or read either Egyptian language for almost 2,000 years. The French had no idea as to what any of the Egyptian symbols or words meant. Were the signs phonetic, like an alphabet, or were they pictorial, like Chinese character writing? Without any clues, they had to start from scratch. A second hurdle was that the stone was broken at the top and sides. The hieroglyphic section at the top was the most damaged. Only 14 lines of text existed. The demonic section in the middle had all of its 32 lines of text, but was broken along the right side. The Greek section consisted of 54 lines. The frustrated French had no way of knowing which words or lines of text matched up with which Greek words. As it turned out, time was not on their side. In August 1801, 2 years after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, the English ended their siege, attacking and forcing the French to surrender Egypt. As part of the withdrawal agreement, French military officers were allowed to keep all their personal possessions, but the Institute in Cairo had to hand over all of their discoveries. The academics were furious. What right did the British military officers have to abscond with the legacy of the past? Egypt belonged to mankind. What would become of these priceless treasures?
When the British got the French to surrender at Alexandria, the Rosetta Stone was already famous, although I think it was more famous in France than it was in Britain. But it was certainly regarded as one of the spoils of war, and it was regarded as one of the fruits of the British victory. The French were distinctly reluctant to let the stone out of their hands and hid it away, trying to pretend they hadn't got it.
You are taking from us our collections, our drawings, our copies of hieroglyphs. But who will give you the key to all that? Without us, this material is a dead language that neither you nor your scientists can understand. Sooner than permit this vandalous spoliation, we will destroy our property. We will scatter it amid the sands and throw it into the sea. If it is celebrity you are aiming for, very well. You can count on the long memory of history. You too will have burnt a library in Alexandria. Member of the French Institute in Cairo, 1801.
General Jacques Menou, now in command after Napoleon's flight back to France, attempted to keep the Rosetta Stone in French hands. After failing in an attempt to smuggle the stone out of Egypt by ship, Menou had it wrapped in cloth and hidden among his private possessions. If confronted, Menou would claim it was his personal property and thus exempt from forfeiture. Knowing the French would try to slip the Rosetta Stone out of the country, the British military brought in William Hamilton from Greece to Egypt. He had an eye for the antiquities of the world. While in Greece, he was instrumental in acquiring the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon in Athens. The British knew he would not leave Egypt without more treasures for the king. Hamilton and the British military suspected Menou of hiding the stone. When confronted at his home in Alexandria, Menou protested vigorously his right to keep the stone, but the British officers were insistent. At the point of a gun, Menou agreed the French were on the losing end of this battle. Rather than destroy the stone, Menou agreed the British were stronger and had won the right to this most valuable of trophies. William Hamilton confirmed the stone was authentic, and the British Army finally took possession of their prize. The Rosetta Stone was immediately shipped back to England, arriving in February 1802. England now had the key, but the French had made copies. The race began in earnest now to see who would decipher its cryptic mysteries first. With all the power and riches of Egypt at hand, fame and glory was destined to the man who found the key. As nations watched, top scholars battled each other to be the one who opened the door. How did bitter rivalries develop between friends? Who were the men who tried and failed to crack the code? Would the Rosetta Stone ever reveal its answers? While ancient Egypt was being rediscovered by the French and English, significant events were unfolding in other parts of the world. The United States of America doubled its size by signing the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Captains Lewis and Clark would soon lead a 2-year expedition across this uncharted land. Thomas Elgin captured the public's imagination when he arranged to take sculptures from the Parthenon in Greece and have them shipped to England. And in China, after nearly 4,000 years of rule, the dynastic era was nearing its end. The Manchu dynasty would be its last. At the beginning of the 1800s, reports from newly explored parts of the world amazed the European and American public. No discovery was too incredible. Anything seemed possible. As news of Egypt's wealth of wonders began to circulate, the fascination for all things Egyptian became insatiable.
There was a feeling that the hieroglyphs contained secrets about the gods, the universe, astronomy, that were simply not known to ordinary people. There was curiosity right from the start because the things are so obvious and so pictorial, and above all because they've been associated with the temples, the priesthood. There was a feeling that they had to contain mysteries, that hieroglyphs weren't just ordinary writing, that there you had a civilization that if only you could crack the mystery would tell us things that nobody had ever thought of.
And now, with the key to the Egyptian language in hand, all eyes turned towards the decoding of the Rosetta Stone. After arriving in London in 1802, copies of the Rosetta Stone's text began to spread to universities throughout Europe. The deciphering race was beginning to develop into the world's greatest detective mystery. Its answers were destined to change our views on religion, science, and history. How would our beliefs in the Bible be affected? What magical medicines and technologies were going to be discovered? How did such an advanced civilization perish? As language specialists first began to study the relationship between the three scripts, no clear pattern was evident. The broken stone seemed to prevent any ability to match words and sentences. Not one hieroglyphic word or phrase could be positively identified. How was this seemingly impossible task going to be accomplished? What should their first steps be? Desperate for any clues, scholars dug into the past for help. The earliest account of the Egyptian language is a Greek book written by Horapollo. Said to be an Egyptian priest, he wrote extensively on the usage and meaning of the hieroglyphs. His 5th century BC book, Hieroglyphica, became the cornerstone of future beliefs. Horapollo wrote of 189 different hieroglyphic signs. With each one, he detailed their description and mythological meaning. While he discussed specifics on individual signs, Horapollo never combined them to form sentences or paragraphs. While many of his findings were correct, his work also contained errors.
Horapollo tells us things that actually are true, but he tells us things for quite the wrong reason. So he says, for example, that in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the word for mother is written with a vulture. That happens to be true. But he then explains that in nature, there are no male vultures. All vultures are female. And there's a great mystery here. Now, later on, as people started to look at the natural world and spotted indeed that there were vultures that were male and female, poor old Horapollo got discredited. So the truth he was telling us got thrown out with the mystical verbiage that he dressed it in.
Scholars attempting to decipher the Rosetta Stone also consulted historians' findings from the Middle Ages. As Europe entered its Renaissance, religious influence supported the idea that the hieroglyphs held answers to biblical mysteries.
People start to interpret ancient Egypt entirely through the Bible. So they look at the pyramids and say, the pyramids are not just ordinary tombs for ordinary kings. They are the granaries that Joseph, in the Bible, put up to collect the grain during the 7 good years in preparation for the 7 years of famine that were going to follow. So the mystery is kept, but it's always filtered through the idea that it reflects a story in the Bible.
Scholars also reviewed the work of German mathematics professor Athanasius Kircher. He became the recognized authority on hieroglyphs during the mid-1600s. Like Horapollo before him, Kircher described each hieroglyph as representing an idea or concept. Unlike Horapollo, Kircher began to combine them into words and phrases. Furthermore, Kircher simply made up imaginary translations. His fanciful readings led even the Pope to believe he could actually read the Egyptian language. Over a century later, at the time of Napoleon's expedition, Kircher's studies were still widely held as true. What the first scholars attempting to decipher the Rosetta Stone found in past fact and fiction was the commonly held belief that hieroglyphs were pictorial, similar to Oriental character writing. Each hieroglyph represented a word or idea. It wasn't until these past theories were abandoned that the Rosetta Stone would finally reveal its clues. In 1802, Sylvestre de Sacy of France and Johann Ackerblad of Sweden were the first to throw out the ideas of the past and try a fresh approach.
They looked at Egyptian hieroglyphs and said, other civilizations write in perfectly normal ways. I don't see why the Egyptians have to be different. They looked also at other documents from Egypt, not simply temples and obelisks and hieroglyphs, but things on papyrus, paper documents. And they said rightly, look, the Egyptians had perfectly good ways of writing perfectly ordinary, everyday letters. Maybe all of their writing system is rational after all.
Decipherment and Archaeological followed the premise that the demonic language used a Western system of writing. They took a number of recurring Greek words, including the pronouns he or his, and the word Greek. They then searched the demonic text for words which repeated in roughly the same locations. They verified that wherever these words occurred in Greek, they appeared in a similar pattern in the demonic.
What these pioneers did was to begin to prove that the script was not just a symbolic script, that there were signs that meant individual letters, stood for individual letters. You no longer looked at it as something esoteric and full of hidden meaning.
Although their first step at translating the demonic text was somewhat promising, Decipherment and Archaeological gave up, having failed to crack the hieroglyphic code. 3 years after the Rosetta Stone's discovery, opening the window onto Egypt's secrets was proving to be far more complex than anyone had thought. The greatest minds of Europe were beginning to think the mysteries of Egypt would stay hidden forever. Following Decipherment and Archaeological's attempt, more than a decade passed without any further serious efforts. Although the public's fascination with ancient Egypt continued to grow, the Rosetta Stone was all but forgotten. For those thinking of trying to decipher the hieroglyphs, the failure of Decipherment and Archaeological proved an intimidating legacy.
There was a feeling, as with most decipherments, that it's a big prize but also a big risk. You could end up covering yourself with glory, and you could end up making a really big fool of yourself. Now, scholars are by temperament rather cautious, and it takes a certain kind of person to say, I don't care if I make a fool of myself, I'm going to have a go at this.
Up next, the race heats up again as a wealthy scientist from England battles a young, obsessed French scholar to find the key. Meet the British genius who decided to spend his summer vacation decoding the Rosetta Stone. How did he become the first to read the hieroglyphs? Also, discover the legend surrounding a sorcerer's prediction that a small-town boy would be the one to bring light to the past. Although more tombs and temples filled with hieroglyphs were being discovered, no one seemed capable of reading ancient Egypt's secrets. This magical language seemed destined to stay buried forever. As the 15th anniversary of the discovery of the Rosetta Stone came and went, no further progress had been made on its deciphering. Although past failures at cracking its riddle seemed to prevent any future serious efforts, two men would soon step forward, each one claiming they were the first to turn the key. In the summer of 1814, a 41-year-old physician, physicist, and linguist from London took a copy of the Rosetta Stone to his country home. He decided to spend his summer vacation mulling over its puzzle. This time, the Rosetta Stone would begin to speak.
Thomas Young was one of the most remarkable people that Britain has ever produced. If you do a list of his achievements, it is quite amazing. He looked at the question of light and how that works, and he comes up with the wave theory of light, which is the foundation of a lot of modern physics. He is interested in the human eye. He's interested in how it sees color. He's interested in perception. And his notions of the human eye are at the basis of a lot of modern optics. This man was probably the most brilliant problem solver that Britain has ever produced.
Young felt much of the mysticism surrounding ancient Egypt was nonsense. He did not believe secrets to the universe were going to be discovered. What attracted him to the Rosetta Stone was that it was a problem, an unsolved mystery, and he wanted a chance to crack it. Young began by concentrating on the words graphically. He located lines in the Greek text which had words occurring more than once. He then attempted to find lines in the demonic text which had groups of symbols repeated these same numbers of times. Using this matching system, Young was systematically able to identify 86 demonic translations, including the words king, Ptolemy, and Egypt. Where de Sacy and Ackerblad had stopped, Young's initial success led him to continue his efforts. Egyptologists had long been fascinated by the hieroglyphs that were surrounded by ovals. Called cartouches, they seemed to be placed strategically in and around the temples and tombs. A few Egyptologists had begun to speculate that a cartouche contained the name of a pharaoh or member of the royal family. Young used this knowledge to work on the theory that the cartouches on the Rosetta Stone would contain the name Ptolemy. The tablet was honoring him, so his name should be in the cartouches in the hieroglyphic section. Young further surmised that because Ptolemy was a Greek name, the Egyptians would have to write his name phonetically. If the hieroglyphs were pictorial, they would not contain symbols for foreign names or words. 4 years after he began, Young correctly matched the Greek letters in the name Ptolemy with the hieroglyphs inside one of the cartouches. In 1818, he was the first one to cause the stone to speak. The hieroglyphic section had spoken its first word, Ptolemy. While his success was beginning to garner the public's attention across the English Channel in France, another man had already been obsessed with the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone. A man Young would initially encourage and then later regret having helped at all.
Thomas Young's work was well known, not only in England, but also in other countries. What's more, he sent copies of his work to various scholars up and down the continent, and particularly to Paris. And copies of Young's work were sent to Sylvestre de Sacy. One day, de Sacy showed a copy of Young's work to a young Frenchman, and the name of the Frenchman was Jean-François Champollion.
Jean-François Champollion's destiny seemed tied to the Rosetta Stone from birth. French legend describes how his bedridden mother was visited by a sorcerer months before Jean-François was born. Looking into the eyes of this sickly woman, the sorcerer saw the past being connected with the future. He predicted this woman's unborn son would be the one to bring light onto the centuries of the past. Champollion was born in Figeac, France, 1790, to a small-town bookseller. When he was 11 and living in a boarding school in Grenoble, news of Napoleon's expedition to Egypt captured the imagination of France. Champollion's older brother, Jacques Joseph, read tales of Egypt's glories and mysteries to his younger brother. When the younger Champollion received a copy of the Rosetta Stone from a cousin who had traveled to Egypt as part of the expedition, he was hooked. Young Jean-François made it his goal to read the hieroglyphs, and that, of course, meant cracking the Rosetta Stone. All his early training was devoted with that in mind. He soon paid little attention to his other studies. Languages were his all-consuming obsession. His studies became focused on Oriental and Middle Eastern languages, especially Coptic. Coptic had been a language spoken by Christians in Egypt and written in Greek.
When he was about 14, Champollion was working far too hard, not on his schoolwork, but on Egyptian hieroglyphics. And he had what nowadays I think would be called a minor nervous breakdown. And he was sent off to recover. And he wrote a letter back to his elder brother saying, "It's so boring here, send me a Chinese grammar." That was the kind of obsessive personality that Champollion was.
Champollion's early studies focused on the deciphering of the demonic language and its relation to Coptic. He had previously believed that hieroglyphs were symbolic, that they were mysterious and could not be deciphered in an ordinary way. But at about the same time as Young, Champollion began to sense the same links between the Greek names and the hieroglyphic cartouches. When reports of Thomas Young's work reached him, Champollion realized in a flash they were correct. Champollion would take Young's work and propel it forward. After obtaining an inscription of the known cartouche of Cleopatra from the Temple of Philae, Champollion recognized that if Ptolemy and Cleopatra have common letters, Their hieroglyphs should have similar signs as well. When Champollion lined up their hieroglyphic names, the signs for P, L, and O lined up. Champollion had proven Young's theory that foreign names were spelled phonetically in the hieroglyphic language. The door was now open, and Champollion was about to walk through.
Champollion realized that Young was right, that you could show that hieroglyphs could write the names of the Greek rulers of Egypt. But that was one thing. It may be that that was simply a way used in later times to write foreign names. The question was whether hieroglyphs went back in the same way into earlier periods.
Champollion took a look at a copy of an inscription from the great temple of Karnak. This inscription had a king's name repeating itself many times. The king's name was written with 3 signs. At the top was a sun disk. Champollion knew from Coptic that the name of the sun in ancient Egyptian was pronounced Ra. At the bottom was a letter that Thomas Young had identified, the letter S. It was written twice. What he now had was the name of a king that began with Ra and ended with S. The middle sign was a tricky one. It had not been deciphered by Young or anyone else, but Champollion traced that sign in the Rosetta Stone. It occurred several times. Whenever it occurred, the corresponding Greek translated into the idea of birth or being born. Champollion knew the Coptic for to give birth was Miseh. So there he had a king's name, beginning with Ra, the middle is Miseh, and the end is S.
And Champollion knew the ancient names of the kings of Egypt, and he knew that there had been a famous king on the throne of Egypt called Ramesses. And suddenly, he realized he was looking at the key to the whole thing. The knowledge of Coptic, the alphabet deciphered by Thomas Young, plus his immense knowledge of ancient Egypt, gave one the decisive breakthrough. And at this point, he comes out with, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it."
Young's reaction to Champollion's efforts were mixed. He was happy to see someone moving along his work, but he was enraged by Champollion's refusal to give him any credit. Champollion may have had the same ideas, but his work was not published. Young's was. When Champollion finally did publish his results, he became the talk of Paris. All of France celebrated the fact that a Frenchman had deciphered the hieroglyphs first. But Champollion couldn't be bothered with such controversy. His tremendous work ethic only grew as his efforts continued with astounding tenacity and speed. He was now determined to compile a complete list of all pharaohs and the dates they held power. By 1824, Champollion had built a hieroglyphic alphabet containing 21 letters. All of Champollion's work was done sitting behind a desk, using copies of inscriptions others had provided. What would happen when he traveled to Egypt and looked at the hieroglyphs firsthand? Could he really make the hieroglyphs speak? What would they finally say? The door was beginning to open into Egypt's past. The Rosetta Stone was finally proving to be the key to unlocking the hieroglyphs. But what did they say? What secrets and mysteries would be revealed? The announcement of Jean-François Champollion's discovery brought him much acclaim in France. The French Academy had previously considered him a crazy obsessive, working away in his room and getting nowhere. But now, suddenly, he was a national hero. The French government asked Champollion to arrange the purchase of British Egyptologist Henry Salt's extensive collection. After its incorporation into the Louvre Museum in 1827, Champollion was appointed the museum's first curator of Egyptian antiquities. However, Champollion had more in his mind than building a museum's inventory. He wanted to travel to Egypt. In 1828, with help from the Museum of Turin in Italy, Champollion organized an expedition to travel up the Nile River. This was the largest scientific effort to Egypt since Napoleon.
It was his first exposure, and an absolute stunning exposure to the monuments of Egypt. And of course, he ran around them like a wild thing, identifying cartouches. This is what was one thing that was obsessing them at the time, trying to establish the dates of monuments and the order of kings, because they had no true framework for Egyptian history that they could base on the evidence from the monuments.
Champollion's trip proved beyond a doubt his methods were accurate. He was able to read the ancient Egyptians' language off the temple walls themselves. His efforts in translating the hieroglyphs are credited with single-handedly creating the science of Egyptology. Egypt was no longer the land of silence. It was now speaking to us from the past. The names of pharaohs such as Ramesses and Tutmosis were legendary, but now their faces could be identified. We now knew when they ruled and in which temples they prayed. Upon returning to Paris, Champollion continued his work. He now had enough material to write the definitive history of Egypt. Unfortunately, he would never get the chance. On March 4th, 1832, Jean-Francois Champollion died.
Champollion never had any doubts about his own ability and about his own achievement. And although he died at the age of 42, towards the end of his life, it was realized what he had done. And the French, quite rightly, created a professorship of Egyptology for him, the first anywhere in the world. So he died knowing that his achievement had been recognized. A lot of Champollion's work was left after his death, and the elder brother collected it, published it as a memorial to the genius in the family.
Where Champollion had focused on the pharaonic history of Egypt, others began to use his tools to study the demonic and hieroglyphic languages. The amount of written material on walls and on papyrus scrolls was tremendous. As the years went by, the social, political, economic history of the ancient Egyptians began to be understood. But it was the personal written records that surprised most people. We learned that by looking at the ancient Egyptians, we were looking at ourselves.
Slowly, it became clear that the Egyptians were like the rest of us. They wrote letters to the bank manager. They wrote letters to the local tax official. They wrote letters to each other about various normal aspects of normal lives. They had literature, just like ours, not very different.
The Rosetta Stone brought back to life the history of both ancient Egypt and of mankind itself. Although the Rosetta Stone has been deciphered now for more than 170 years, we're still only scratching the surface of what mysteries are buried. From the spectacular treasures found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun in 1922, to the uncovering of the tomb of the sons of Ramesses the Great in 1995, ancient Egypt is still providing new and amazing discoveries.
The Rosetta Stone is a milestone between a period when all we knew about our own origins was in the Bible or in the writings of the Greeks and the Romans. After the Rosetta Stone, we start to look at ancient history speaking for itself. It starts to say, where have we come from? Where have the ideas come from? What are our roots? And the Rosetta Stone is a way of bringing us face to face with our own identity.
And now, through the extraordinary efforts of men like Napoleon Bonaparte, Thomas Young, and Jean-Francois Champollion, the riddle of the Rosetta Stone has been solved. The language and mysteries of the ancient Egyptians can now be understood. ancient Egypt remained silent, waiting for its own rebirth. It took one of the most powerful men of all time to awaken Egypt from its sleep, a man whose leadership in battle was matched only by his passion for history. During the late 1700s, the French and British were fighting a war for world domination. In 1798, General Napoleon Bonaparte proposed leading the French army on a military invasion of Egypt. If the French could command this crossroads between Europe and Asia, they would control trade and become the most powerful country in the world. By this time, the 29-year-old Napoleon had become a legend in the French army. His victories over Austrian forces in Italy established France and himself as new powers to be reckoned with. Napoleon's sense of history and unknown shapes. Many surround paintings of Egyptians giving offerings to animal-headed gods. Even their dead were buried with this sacred script on their wrappings and coffins. What do these strange carvings say? Did the Egyptians possess black magic medicine and powerful weapons? Would they provide us with answers to the Bible's mysteries? What was needed was a clue, a key to unlock the mystery. Like the rediscovery of ancient Egypt, the finding of an unusual and puzzling tablet would be only the beginning. By the time of Christ, the ancient Egyptians were already legends of a distant past. Greek and Roman historians could only guess at what knowledge this once powerful civilization possessed. As the centuries passed and Europe had its Renaissance, and how did this seemingly insignificant rock forever change our belief in mankind's past? For 2,000 years, the history of ancient Egypt was buried in the sands of time. Travelers and scholars were aware of the existence of these mysterious people, but nothing was known about them. What kind of men built these gigantic pyramids the size of mountains? To what gods did they dedicate their enormous temples the size of cities? And why did they preserve their dead, burying with them treasures beyond belief? Visitors to this ancient world find strange picture writing everywhere. First called hieroglyphs by the Greeks, this mystical language fills the temples, monuments, and tombs. Walls abound with bizarre pictures of animals, human heads, and destiny led him to view Egypt as his next prize. On July 1st, 1798, Napoleon's army sailed into Egypt's port city of Alexandria. In addition to 38,000 soldiers, 167 of France's top scientists and scholars were on board. Rarely have military expeditions had academic interests as well. What was Napoleon's plan? Why was he fascinated with ancient Egypt? Like Alexander the Great, did Napoleon believe his destiny was to annex Egypt on his way towards conquering the world? The egocentric Napoleon viewed Egypt as more than just a cornerstone in his empire. He knew of its legends, its power, and its history. This was the land of the pharaohs. These kings were considered gods. Man devoted his entire life to deciphering its cryptic messages. Next, on Ancient Mysteries. The British Museum in London is filled with many remarkable antiquities from ancient Egypt. Among their treasures are 3,000-year-old mummies and colossal statues honoring great pharaohs. But there is one item that is more valuable than all the rest. At the entrance to their Egyptian collection is a large stone tablet, one that could be overlooked if not for its conspicuous and prominent position. It's known as the Rosetta Stone, one of the most important treasures of all time. What is the Rosetta Stone?